Part 3. And then. Chapter 27. Teo's biography of Lord Lugard was greeted with critical acclaim. The York Times named it Biography of the Year, while the Observer described it as the most significant historical text to hail from Africa in recent times. Vanessa knew that Teo would be touring England to promote the book, but it still came as a surprise when her editor sent her his tour dates and she realized she would be seeing him soon. She had considered contacting him before the event, but decided against it. Better just to appear and not make a fuss, except that here she was, minutes after he had greeted her, with trembling hands and Terry to go back into the room where he was. In the early years she had dreamt constantly about this first re-encounter. They would gaze at each other and everyone else would disappear. Of course, she hadn't expected any of that today. After all these years, but she imagined that their meeting, nevertheless, would be nostalgic. Two old frictions. Lovks. It NCVCR crossed HCR mind that HC might not recognize her. She had arrived a little late, just as Teo was being introduced, and he glanced at her briefly without recognition as she slipped quietly into one of their back rows. Only at the end of his talk, when she stood up, did he really see her. "Vanessa," he exclaimed, and everyone turned to look. "I'll be right back," she called, not knowing what else to do but run and gather some composure. Now, standing in the privacy of the ladies' toilet, Vanessa looked into the mirror. She placed both hands flat against her forehead and pulled. This way she was able to hide the grey and take away the wrinkles, but when she removed her hands everything popped back, the grey hairs and fur rows that ran along her forehead and spread like fine cat's whiskers from their corner of each eye. She shook her head and sighed. Then, startled by a sharp knock on the door, she dropped the compact she was holding and watched as a powdery plume of blue and purple eyeshadow billowed across the floor. "Just a minute. Hold on," she called, bending down to pick up the broken bits. The powder crumbled when touched, so she used her foot to kick what she could out of sight beneath the sink. Quickly, she washed her hands and opened the door, but nobody was there. Whoever had knocked had left. She returned to the seminar room where people still waited in line to meet Teo and have their books signed. She smiled, calmer now, watching him interact, ever gracious and charming, with only a sprinkling of white hair. He had barely aged and was just as handsome as she remembered, though not quite as fashionable. He wore grey trousers a little flared at the ankles, and a green-colored shirt with a wide collar. HC looked up from where HC sat and gestured for her not to hiccup. "Take your time," she gestured back, taking a mint from her bag, as well as a notebook. Usually, the latter would have been covered with scribbles capturing what their speaker had said, his style of presentation, the questions and responses, but today she had been too distracted to write. What would they say to each other? What would she say? She jumped in surprise when he touched her shoulder. She had not seen him coming and stood up too quickly, but he caught her before she tripped. "Teo. I'm sorry, Vanessa." "No, it's not you. It's me." She laughed nervously. "It's wonderful to see you," he said, as she straightened herself. "And you." She expected him to let go of her arms, but he didn't. Instead he held on and kept looking at her. "I was." "You." They spoke simultaneously, then stopped, then tried again. The same thing happened. "Dinner?" Teo laughed, gently letting go of her arms. Outside, day stretched luxuriously into evening, the way it always did on warm summer nights. "So where do we start after 20 years? Teo began. 20, Vanessa repeated. "You left in 66 and I came," she said, making it sound as though she were just working it out. 27 years. "My goodness," Teo exclaimed. "And now you're Ma." "Right. Any children?" Their arms kept bumping into each other clumsily as they walked. "Yes. A son." He nodded and slipped his hands into his coat pockets. He still had his lovely, broad shoulders. Probably always would. She was tempted to touch them, just slip her hand behind his back and rest it on his shoulder like old times. And? Teo held out his hand. Did he want her to take his hand? She wasn't sure whether he wanted her to, or whether it was simply a gesture. "Where did you meet your husband?" he continued, slowly closing his hand. "How old is your son? I want to know everything." "Everything?" She raised her eyebrows, feeling suddenly irritated by his words. Did he think he could simply waltz back into her life and ask whatever he wished? Well, she paused, thinking of those first 2 years apart, a period that at the time had seemed like the worst years of her life. Did he know? Of course he didn't. "I got a job with The Guardian," she said simply. "I didn't realize you worked with them as early as that." "Yes, but in those days I wasn't a journalist." "What were you doing?" "Making tea." "Lots of tea," she smiled. "And being paraded about at lunches by my boss. I should never have stayed, but I was young and naive. You know how it is." "I'd forgotten how much I missed your smile," he said. "Oh, Teo." She started to laugh. "I've missed you, too," she wanted to say but couldn't. That as well." And the laugh," he added. "I've miss." "How is your family?" she asked. It was an awkward transition, but he obliged by telling her a few things about his daughter and her chosen field of. "To be honest, I really didn't want Cammy to apply for drama or music. Archie_study. Texture would have been better. Why not something in the arts?" "It's hypocritical of me, isn't it?" He nodded. "But it's so hard to be an artist in Africa these days. You must know. I just don't want my daughter to be discouraged when she returns home." "If she returns," Vanessa added. "Yes," he nodded. "I suppose one can never take these things for granted and, to be honest, I don't think she will." Vanessa noticed his phrase, "to be honest." He seemed fond of those words these days. "But look, I'm doing all the talking. Tell me about you, Vanessa. And how are your parents?" "Mum died in 78. From cancer." "I'm so sorry to hear that." "I'm very sorry." "Thank you," she nodded. "But father's fine. Getting old," she added. Teo nodded. "And your husband? Who's the lucky man?" "Actually? Well?" He smiled. "Who's the lucky man?" "It's Edward. Edward Barker." "Really?" he stammered, remembering the history dom at Oxford. Well, how is he after all these years?" "Isabella went back to Italy," she said. If Teo was shocked, he did a good job of disguising it, certainly better than she did of hiding her awkwardness as she told him about the divorce. She then felt compelled to make it clear that nothing had ever happened between them when they had been at Oxford. It was only by chance, she explained, that she met Edward years later in London. "You must tell me about your time in Dakar," Teo continued. That was when I started reading your articles, all those fantastic pieces on Senghor, Haussmann, and Barr. It must have been wonderful. It was, she replied, wondering what he really thought of her being married to Edward. She had not told Edward she would be coming to hear Theo speak. You know, I've been following your career closely, Vanessa. Have you? She turned to face him. Do you remember once in Oxford when you asked me what I thought of you becoming an African journalist? One do. And now you're Africa's favorite writer. I have a file at home with all of your articles, at least, those I could get hold of in Nigeria. He had followed his career too. It was her job to keep track of African artists, ink scholars, but in Theo's case she would have done it anyway. Here we are, he said, pointing to the Indian restaurant. As they approached, Vanessa wanted to tell him how the smell of curry always reminded her of his New Year's culinary experiment, but then she remembered that it had been in Edward's old house, so she said nothing as he continued to talk about her writing. You know, the first piece I read of yours was that article on Festac, he said as they sat down. It was a superb article. You were critical of the organizers and used Fela's zombie lyrics to make your point. Yes, she nodded, remembering her initial excitement at being in Nigeria and hoping to run into him. So you never went to Festac? He shook his head as a waiter arrived, depositing glasses of water and a basket full of papadums. She broke one and handed half to Theo. Doesn't this remind you of Oxford? She nodded. What was the name of that Indian place we went to? Viceroy's or Raj, I think it was called. Something with a colonial ring. He tapped his forehead to remember. The Taj. That's right, he laughed, longer than seemed necessary. The conversation had grown awkward again, and Vanessa wished the waiter had given them more time before returning to announce the choice of candy, mints, mango chutney, spicy sauce, yogurt. The man beamed. You must tell me more about the books you write for children, she said, searching for a neutral topic of conversation. Initially inspired by you, Vanessa. You gave me a first edition copy of Winnie the Pooh, remember? Well, that was what started me thinking about children's literature. But I want to know more about you. Are you still in touch with friends from St. Hugh's? I've been to a few Gaudies, but I don't really have time to stay in touch. She didn't feel like saying much more. It bothered her that he seemed so calm. And Jane? He asked. The last I heard, she had married a rich American and was living somewhere in California. We haven't stayed in touch. And you? What about the Bal Lyle crowd? She asked so that he would talk instead. No, I'm not in touch. He shook his head. Except for a brief correspondence with Simon and what I've read through the record, but the other day I found one of my books. I don't think I ever told you this, but I used to keep a record of all the titled people I met at Oxford. I did it for my father, but the funny thing is that most of the names I wrote down became nothing, or not famous. In any case. And you, my friend Vanessa, have become the most famous of all. Oh, don't be silly. But it's true. So I wasn't in your book of names? You were so much in my head, Vanessa, that I didn't need to write your. She ate some more, aware that he was watching her. She wished he would not name down. It meant that she couldn't eat gracefully, papadum bits bursting inelegantly her mouth. He hadn't touched his. I was so much in your head that you found someone else, she ventured. He looked down at his plate as two waiters struggled to find room for oblong platters of rice and chicken. In the end, she removed the large vase of plastic carnations, impatient for the waiters to leave. I was young then, he spoke quietly, keeping his eyes fixed on the food. Silence hung uncomfortably between them as she remembered the timing. Lagos. To Teo, she said finally, lifting her glass. And to you. He clinked his glass against hers, holding her gaze briefly. Will you tell me about those early days in Nigeria? She helped herself from the plate he was offering. Those were the good years, weren't they? I mean politically and economically. The rice clung stubbornly together, so she pressed harder. Teo's grip on the plate remained firm. I missed you, Vanessa. She waited for him to say more. And just as she thought she should break the silence, someone did it for her. It is you. Look at you, old chap, the man exclaimed, striding across their room towards them. You don't recognize me, do you? It's Samir from Bradford. Remember? For several minutes, in their excitement to see each other, the men seemed to have forgotten that Vanessa was there. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your wife? Samir asked, curious now as he turned to acknowledge Vanessa. No, this is Vanessa Richardson. She writes for The Guardian. I see, he winked, slapping Teo again across the shoulders. Not another of your girlfriends then. So what's wrong with that bloody ruler of yours? Samir bellowed, pulling a chair from a neighboring table. Any real chance of him returning the country to civilian rule? I don't know, Teo replied, glancing at Vanessa. Still waiting for your Nehru dynasty? Samir laughed loudly, oblivious to the restaurant owner's disapproving looks. And what a bloody mess India has got herself in now. What to do? Bloody power-hungry all of them. And I thought you were bound for politics, old chap. What happened? I teach now. Yes, you're wise, old chap. So look, where's your wife? She's here, well not here. Teo paused, but in London. Doing the holiday shopping? Actually no. She lives here now and my daughter too. My wife runs a nursing facility for the elderly. Then you must all come and visit us. I have 3 daughters now and... Excuse me a moment please, Vanessa interrupted. Teo looked up, anxious, but Vanessa pretended not to notice. She went in search of the restaurant owner to ask for the phone and left a message for Edward, letting him know she would be late. She felt angry with Samir for them, and annoyed with Teo for letting the man stay. She contemplated a cigarette, but it had been years since she last smoked, so she went to the ladies' room instead and fiddled with her hair, straightening the side parting and removing more grey hairs. What am one doing here? She thought, returning to the table. She reminded Teo that she had a train to catch and Samir offered to drive her to the station. She would have preferred that he left them in peace, but Samir was insisting. Now what? She thought, staring angrily at the empty tracks as she and Teo stood, finally alone, at Birmingham New Street. A rat scurried along one of the metal girders, and she muttered to herself. What was that? Teo asked. Nothing, she answered, trying not to convey her impatience. You're angry with me, aren't you? He touched her arm. Angry? She shook her head, knowing she was no good at pretending. I'm sorry about Samir. It's okay. I meant what I said when I told you I missed you, he continued. And I'm sorry, very sorry, for the way things ended between us. Not that it means anything now, but I loved you, Vanessa. I always did and ... Well. His voice trailed off. She touched his hand, half clutching at his fingers and half stroking them. What was the point in being angry? It was too late for that now. He stepped closer, facing her, and reached for her arms. "Could I kiss you?" he asked, just as her train arrived. She stalled for a brief moment, then gently lifted his hands from her arms. "I'll miss my train, Teo."